You're watching This Week in Space with Miles O'Brien. Brought to you by Omega.
Hello and welcome. Our theme this week is détente, as in the easing of hostilities between rivals. It is what we saw in space 35 years ago this week, when Apollo and Soyuz joined together in low Earth orbit. And it's what we're seeing unfold over the past few days in Washington, as Congress and the White House try to compromise on what is next for NASA after the shuttles are retired. The Senate Commerce Committee unanimously approved an authorization bill that embraces much of what the White House space vision is, with some key differences. Under the Senate plan, NASA will launch Atlantis one more time next year, meaning there are 3 shuttle missions remaining. NASA will begin work on a heavy lift rocket immediately, not in 2015 as Obama had promised. As for the similarities, ferrying cargo and astronauts to low Earth orbit will still fall to commercial companies. The ISS gets a lease extension to 2020, and there is more money earmarked for space and Earth science and aeronautics. The man leading the charge on this, Senator Bill Nelson of Florida. He bristled when reporters suggested the new plan mandates NASA do exactly what the Augustine Commission warned against. That's to say, throwing out Constellation to start work on an underfunded new rocket.
What this does is set up a new heavy lift vehicle on a deadline of December 31st, 2016, and that is achievable because of the policy that has been set by the committee. The committee cannot tell NASA how to design a rocket, but we can give policy direction to the executive branch of government, and we've done that in the bill, utilizing shuttle-derived technology, building on that, making it evolvable, not building the largest rocket around, but starting in the range of 75 to 100 metric tons that is evolvable, and that would be built over the course of those 6 years within a budget of $11.5 billion. Now that is doable. And if anybody tells you that it's not, then if I were you, I would question their particular agenda. But of course, there were many different interests.
In the interest of détente, the White House released a statement saying, in part, the Senate bill represents an important first step towards helping us achieve the key goals the President has laid out. We look forward to continuing to work with Congress to help advance an ambitious and achievable space program, one that helps blaze a new trail of innovation and discovery.
Less than 5 meters distance.
35 years ago this week, they were blazing a whole new trail in space when 2 space capsules, a Soviet Soyuz and an American Apollo, rendezvoused and docked in low Earth orbit. The Apollo Soyuz test project captured the attention of the world as the 2 nuclear superpowers put their differences aside and found they had much in common. This past week, the surviving crew members came to New York City to the Omega Watch Boutique on 5th Avenue to celebrate the anniversary. Hey, what better place to mark a moment in time? What they accomplished on their mission planted the seed for the International Space Station. I asked U.S. Commander Tom Stafford about that. Let's talk about 35 years plus Apollo Soyuz. You know, even as we speak, there's 6 people up there, 3 Russians, 3 Americans on that International Space Station.
Right.
1 million pounds in orbit.
Right.
You guys started it, didn't you?
We
That must
did.
make you feel good, huh?
Well, it makes me feel real good because, again, you know, I volunteer work in NASA. I chair the Independent Oversight Committee of the Space Station, but all the tasks, the procedures, the guidelines all got started when we worked together on Apollo Soyuz, which is at the height of the Cold War and did the impossible.
Stafford flew with 2 rookies, one of whom was his boss. The late Deke Slayton, one of the original Mercury 7, was grounded for years because of a heart murmur, but finally got a clean bill of health. Also on board Apollo, Vance Brand, who later commanded 3 shuttle missions. He remembers the Cold War context well.
Back at that time, you know, we had pretty rough feelings between the Soviets and the Americans, and it was a different atmosphere, a different time, and we felt very good about breaking the ice, getting more communication between East and West, and now I think it's truly blossomed, though. They're doing things on the space station that we probably would have thought it impossible 35 years ago.
The Soviets were led by Alexei Leonov, the first person to walk in space. He flew with Valery Kubasov. What did you think about the Americans, and how did your perception of the Americans differ from the reality?
Oh, Americans astronaut? Oh, I know them 37 years. We have preparation in United States and Soviet Union for this flight, and visit families, visit interesting place. During preparation, we did not have problems. No problems. One problem. I have one problem.
What was that?
Tom Stafford language.
It's that Okie. Is it the Okie thing?
We used English language. American astronaut used the Russian language, but Oklahoma, Tom Stafford language.
It's
not possible to no. It was difficult for us. What?
Thanks to Omega for hosting that great event. As you probably know, the company has a long, rich history with human spaceflight. More on that at the end of the program. But first, a little more about Apollo Soyuz.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. The countdown has proceeded smoothly this morning, and the flight crew here at the Kennedy Space Center were alerted about 10:30. They're right now in the suit room at the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building, donning their spacesuits, and they're scheduled to leave the suit room about 12:37 for the trip out to Pad B.
It was an ironic conclusion to Apollo. A program that was all about Cold War rivalry and competition ended in July of 1975 with the launch of a new era of cooperation in space. 7 hours after cosmonauts Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov left Soviet-controlled Kazakhstan on a Soyuz rocket, a Saturn 1B carrying astronauts Tom Stafford, Deke Slayton, and Vance Brand launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
Building up thrust. Moving out. Clear the tower. Roger, tower clear.
Apollo and Soyuz would join together in space on July 17th.
It was at the height of the Cold War, and at that time each country had literally thousands of strategic nuclear weapons pointed at each other, plus probably a few thousand tactical weapons. But yet, in spite of all these two great superpowers, both on the land and the air and in space, having somewhat adversarial relationships, it was decided we would have a joint mission in space.
But it was more than symbolism, a point not lost on Hollywood, which in 1969 released the movie Marooned, 3 U.S. astronauts stranded in orbit, saved by the Soviets.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Later, life nearly imitated art. During the Apollo 13 crisis in April of 1970, the Russians offered assistance. At the time, most Americans might have been surprised to hear that, but the roots of cooperation in space between the Cold War rivals were deep. As early as 1963, President John F. Kennedy proposed the two nations explore space together. The two nations signed a pair of treaties to allow joint rescue and recovery missions. And then in 1970, the U.S. proposed a test of docking hardware that could join Apollo and Soyuz. At the 1972 Superpower Summit, the idea became a reality. And by 1973, the astronauts and cosmonauts were visiting and training together in both countries.
You know, when we first flew into Moscow and they came to the United States, why, we'd all heard a lot of bad things about the other's country, and it was really almost instantaneous, though, our getting together and understanding each other. We were in the same business. We were all dealing with spacecraft, and of course, Alexei and Valery were very easy to get along with, and I think from the very beginning, any concerns that we had went away.
In fact, they got along famously.
I want to visit Hollywood because I want to be a movie star. No, I don't want. Tom Stafford want.
I was very pleasantly surprised when I realized that American astronauts were very well technically prepared. They were real professionals. And on a lighter note, I was surprised that they never eat borscht at home. Russians cannot survive without borscht. And we like porridge, and American astronauts like steak.
Perhaps the biggest barrier was language. Sure, there was Russian and English, but each space program also had its own lexicon of terminology and acronyms. Add to that Tom Stafford's famous Okie dialect, which often left Americans scratching their heads.
Look, I'll speak Russian to you, you speak English to me, and let's try that. And then later we spoke with Alexei on this and started working, and so then that's how we started then going, because then once we started to speak Russian to them, and then they spoke English to us, started communicating.
Moscow is go for docking, Houston is go for docking. It's up to you guys. Have fun.
The docking itself went smoothly, and it was clear from the radio banter the crews had truly become a crew.
Here he comes just above the docking module. Looks real pretty. Come in, Tom.
I am approaching Soyuz.
Tom, please don't forget about your engine.
Contact. Capture.
Soyuz and Apollo are shaking hands now.
They flew as one spacecraft for 2 days, spending time on both sides of the airlock, signing proclamations, eating with and toasting each other. The whole world watched and celebrated the brief thaw in the Cold War.
In the name of the Soviet people and from myself.
The national leaders were for this. They sort of, I believe, said, let's make it work. And then everything just flowed down. It allowed the Soviets to be more comfortable working for us, and us more comfortable working for them.
It's been a most rewarding 2 days here in space working with the Apollo Soyuz project. This is the results of the determination, the cooperation, and the efforts by the governments of the two countries, by the managers, engineers, and all the workers involved. It's been a very rewarding experience.
Gentlemen, let me call to express my very great admiration for your hard work, your total dedication in preparing for this first joint flight. All of us here in Washington, in the United States, send to you our very warmest congratulations for your successful rendezvous and for your docking, and we wish you the very best for a successful completion of the remainder of your mission. Your flight is a momentous event and a very great achievement, not only for the 5 of you, but also for the thousands of American and Soviet scientists and technicians who have worked together for 3 years to ensure the success of this very historic and very successful experiment in international cooperation. And may I say, in signing off, here's to a soft landing.
It was a nearly disastrous landing for the Apollo crew. An air vent opened prematurely, allowing noxious gases to seep into the capsule. The crew spent 2 weeks in the hospital, but that did nothing to obscure the accomplishment or diminish the significance of the turning point. President Ford was prescient. Apollo Soyuz planted the seed for Shuttle Mir and eventually the International Space Station.
I am sure It was real, only beginning of our future cooperation, not only in space, but in other fields.
In fact, there would not be an International Space Station without Apollo Soyuz. And while the Senate bill we told you about earlier envisions another mission for Atlantis to the station, until that happens, the Endeavour STS-134 mission is still the last in line. And the external fuel tank that will power that shuttle to orbit arrived at the Kennedy Space Center a few days ago after a safe voyage across the BP-tainted Gulf. The mission is set to fly at the end of February. STS-134 will deliver a cosmic ray detector called the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer to the International Space Station. Engineers at ESA's European Space Research and Technology Center in the Netherlands are currently putting the AMS through some final testing. They released some new video this week. When they wrap it up, they'll be packing it up for shipment to the Kennedy Space Center and ultimately Endeavour's payload bay. AMS is designed to search the universe for dark matter and antimatter. It will be the last big piece of science equipment the shuttle will take to the ISS. Another important milestone for those of you who would like to catch a brief ride to space. The Virgin Galactic Enterprise, or Spaceship Two, flew with a crew the other day. Not to space, mind you. She remained firmly attached to the belly of the mothership, Eve. Maybe next time the Branson and Rutan-led team will cut the cord and see how she glides. The Japanese Space Agency, or JAXA, has been hard at it doing some cool things of late. The solar sail experiment, called Icaros, launched in May, is accelerating through space as designed, pushed along by photons of light. JAXA confirmed last month that the sail had unfurled but held off on the high fives until they could be sure that it is zipping along as planned. The 680-pound spacecraft is more than 11 million miles from Earth, headed toward Venus. And Japanese scientists have cracked open the Hayabusa sample return canister. You remember Hayabusa. It's the spacecraft designed to gather dust from an asteroid and return it to Earth for analysis. Here it is streaking across the sky over the South Pacific en route to a parachute landing in the Australian outback on June 13th. The good news is there is dust in there. What still needs to be determined is the origin of the dust particles. Are they from the asteroid or are they dust bunnies from Earth? I guess that's why they have clean rooms for spacecraft. Wish my teenagers had them. Speaking of clean rooms, the one at the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena is a busy place these days. That's where they're assembling the Mars Science Lab, known as Curiosity, and it's spinning its wheels. That's a good thing. These 6 aluminum wheels are bigger than car tires and were just installed on the rover over the past few weeks. Engineers are putting the wheels through their paces, testing each actuator or motor to make sure they're all functioning properly. This rover will have 6-wheel drive and is designed to roll over large rocks and climb steep hills without tipping over. Beats a Hummer. And that radioactive battery power gives it great mileage. Launch is slated for late next year. New pictures from the Solar Dynamics Observatory show the arcing magnetic loops of an active solar region in profile. Pretty cool stuff. SDO captured these extreme ultraviolet images earlier this month, just as the loops were rotating into view. These structures are linked with solar flares, and several small ones did erupt from this region. Can't wait to see what sort of arcs SDO will show us next time a major flare shoots off. And that talk about solar flares reminded us about the zombie satellite. Researchers at the U.S. Naval Research Lab say there is more evidence a solar storm fried ZombieSat, more formally known as Intelsat's Galaxy 15, happened back on April 5th. Instruments aboard NASA's Stereo spacecraft indicate a coronal mass ejection associated with a moderate-sized solar flare hit Earth just when Galaxy 15, ZombieSat, went south. Now, ZombieSat is apparently drifting along on a stable and predictable path. Though command and control has been lost, it's still transmitting. So while operators say a collision is unlikely, the zombie could interfere with other birds. So don't bang on your TV set. Blame it on the zombie. Back now to that Apollo Soyuz anniversary event at the Omega Boutique in New York City. All 5 members of that crew 35 years ago wore Omega Speedmaster professional watches, more commonly known as the Moon Watch. It's It's like this one. We're gratified that Omega is joining us as a sponsor this week, and we thought you might like to hear the surprising origins of Omega's ubiquitous presence in space. It's the ultimate in product placement. NASA and the Omega Speedmaster have been strapped together since the early days of the space program. But you may be surprised the idea did not begin in the Omega marketing department.
So in fact, the first time that Omega really knew that the watch was being worn in space and ultimately on the moon was a picture of Ed White when he had his first space flight in '65. So it all started back then.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
When President John F. Kennedy issued his bold challenge to fly to the moon before 1970, NASA knew its astronauts would need a timepiece they could trust with their lives. So when the Manned Spaceflight Center was still under construction, NASA sent an engineer to a local jeweler. He bought a half-dozen fine watches, all the best brands, brought them back to the lab, and started running them through a brutal gauntlet of tests.
The Omega Speedmaster, in order to pass all of NASA's tests, had to withstand the temperatures that it would see in the vacuum of space. It was exposed to vacuums and high-pressure situations. It was exposed to gravity, increased gravities, and zero-G to see if it would work in both.
Only one watch passed all the tests, the Speedmaster, which Omega introduced in 1957. It was and remains the premier official watch for the U.S. space program, the primary timer for spacewalkers and moonwalkers, and a life-saving backup.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
During the Apollo 13 crisis, the crew had to shut down virtually all systems to conserve battery power. So they used a Speedmaster to time the burn that would send them on a trajectory to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. A nail-biting moment captured by Hollywood in the movie Apollo 13.
We're going to burn at 10% thrust for 39 seconds. Jack, you time us? Got it. Give us a count of the last 10 seconds up to 39, and let's not miss this.
NASA gave Omega a coveted Silver Snoopy Award for helping save the day.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
The watch also served as a backup for the first moon landing. Apollo 11 Commander Neil Armstrong discovered a broken timer in the lunar module before the first moonwalk.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
He left his Speedmaster inside the LEM to ensure he would have a backup. Buzz Aldrin's Omega became the first watch to operate outside on the surface of the moon. A few years later, the Smithsonian asked Buzz to send it to Washington for public display.
Buzz packaged it up as was requested with other items that he was donating to the museum, and he sent it shipping to Washington, D.C. from California. Somewhere in transit, that package went missing, and there was no tracking number to track it down either, so somewhere is Buzz Aldrin's watch. No one knows where it is.
It may be hard to beat the historic and aesthetic appeal of the traditional Speedmaster moonwatch, but Omega has not stopped there. Working closely with astronaut and Omega ambassador Lieutenant General Tom Stafford, the company created the Speedmaster X33, which among other things has a timer that can keep track of days and sounds alarms that can be heard over the din of all that equipment on the shuttle and the space station. In 2003, station crew member Don Pettit opened up his X33 to reattach the stem and a button, the first and only watch repair in space.
And dealing with all these little tiny pieces is not as difficult as you would first imagine when you're in a weightless environment.
Omega is also the watch of choice for the Russian space program, and Speedmasters were on the wrists of both commanders for the most famous handshake in space ever during the Apollo Soyuz test project in July of 1975. Omega has made a special limited edition watch to commemorate the anniversary. The face of the smaller dials is made of meteorite.
Well, you know, we've been doing this for a long time, and it's always looking for some new ideas, and we felt that to have a dial made of a real meteorite from space would be something that maybe would add value to this watch for collectors who really cherish this sort of product. So the dial is a real meteorite from space, and a very special case back that you can see here that is emblem of the mission.
The mission at Omega has always been precision, And for space lovers, there is no watch that comes close. In fact, in these rarefied circles, wearing a Speedmaster is practically mandatory.
If you walk into a room of space enthusiasts and you look down your wrist and you're wearing an Omega, then you're a true spacer. If not, then if you're wearing some other brand, well, we're not going to hold it against you, but you're not in the club.
Oh look, my Speedmaster says it's high time we call it a show. Thanks for being with us. Please tell your friends about us. Have them watch us on YouTube or iTunes. If you like our show, please consider tossing us a few bucks via PayPal at spaceflightnow.com/twist. You can email us, twist@spaceflightnow.com, tweet us at This Week in Space. Check out the blog version, milesobrien.com. Thanks so much to our sponsor this week, Omega. We really appreciate it. Next time on This Week in Space, it's our last episode of the season. We're not going anywhere, and neither are these guys who are locked into a habitat for 520 days. Say what you want about those Mars 500 guys, but they're keeping it clean. In space, no one can hear you scrub, though. Join us for that and more. We'll see you next time.